Okay, good evening to everyone. And so last week's Parsha just had all of these mysteries to it. This week's Parsha is in that sense much less mysterious. There's only one little mystery. Who was that man that Yosef bumps into in Shechem, or when he's on his way to Shechem, really in Dotan? But otherwise, it's pretty straightforward family story. And from the beginning of this week's Parsha till the end of the book, almost the entire story is focused on Yosef. Uh, and that's significant in many ways. It's significant, first of all, because he's not a patriarch. Until now, from chapter 12, when we met Avraham, and until now, all of the heroes of our stories are that triumvirate of patriarchs, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Now Yosef is our hero, but he has to partner with brothers, and that causes problems. And but the other thing that's interesting about Yosef is the first successful Jew in Galut, in the diaspora, in the exile. And we have a history of Jews who were tremendously successful while outside of Eretz Israel. I mean, before the Bible is finished, we have the prophet Daniel is very successful in Persia. Yechezkel is very famous in Babylon, and of course we have Esther is very successful in Persia. So he becomes a paradigm of what's later going to be people like the Rambam and Shmuel HaNagid in Spain, who became a great general. The Rothschild family. We can think of many successful, famous Jews in the diaspora that he becomes the prototype for. But as he's going into Galut, there's a very strong statement that is warning us, describing to us why and how he is going to be so successful. And that's the pasuk that's on the top of our page. Vayehi Hashem et Yosef. It's very, very hard to figure out the dikduk, the grammar of that. The Hebrew little word et only follows a transitive verb. In other words, it's before a direct object. Ani makeh et hayad. I hit my et. I'm doing something too. Here, vayehi is not a transitive verb. There's not an action verb. It's the verb to be. It's very hard to figure out what's going on in this phrase. And God will be to Yosef. It doesn't really fit into our norms of Hebrew grammar. It's a very unusual statement, and we're going to return to the problem of that a little bit later in the class. I just wanted to raise it now. So it says first that God will be with Yosef. The next phrase, Vayehi ish matzliach, and he will be a successful man. Vayehi beveit Adonav hamitri, and he will be in the house of his master, his Egyptian master, his master who's an Egyptian. And so each one of those, Vayehi, should sort of be translated, and he will be. But all the translations I looked at, this is the Jewish Publication Society translation here, doesn't want to just say it that way. So it said, the Eternal was with, he was a successful man. And the last one, and he was in the house, he translated as, and he stayed in the house of his Egyptian master. So 3 times we have Vayehi. Now, and here we're saying that Vayehi sort of means he was there. There was just, God was with him. He was there. The master was with him. But we first saw this word Vayehi way back in the beginning of Breshit, and it says Vayehi or, let there be light. It's the same word. There are some scholars of grammar that tried to say that the format is a little bit different, that this one is really a present tense, and Vayehi over there is sort of a future, and it should become. But when we look at it as people who don't know that much, technical grammar, it's the same word. So let there be or, let there be light. So let it be. Now I'm quoting the Beatles. Let it be, right? Vayehi, let it be. Here it's sort of saying, let God be with Yosef. Let Yosef be a successful man. Let Yosef be in the house. So it's not just describing that it's there, it's also like framing a reality. And the fact of the matter is, a lot of commentaries had a little bit of trouble exactly what do we mean by these 3 Vayehis in our verse. So the Sforno, who himself was a very successful person in Galut, in the house of a weird sort of powerful master. He lived with the Pope in the Vatican, or he lived in Rome. He didn't actually live in the Vatican. He lived in Rome. He worked for a number of Renaissance popes, translating Hebrew texts into Latin and Italian. He was a very famous linguist, very well-known, very successful man in Rome in the 1500s. So like Yosef, he made it big in the diaspora. So he looks at the verse a beautiful way, and other people are going to look at it the same way in a similar idea. But I think the nicest explanation, it's a progression. And it was, and it was, and it was. And he says the 3. Vayehi Hashem et Yosef, first one, to save him. The first time it says God was with him was just to keep him safe, to save him from anyone who would take advantage of him. The second Vayehi is a step higher. He achieved every venture that he set out to accomplish. First one, he was protected. Next one, he was successful. Third one, Vayehi bebeit Adonav HaMitzri, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. He would perform tasks in his master's private room. The meaning of the word Haya here is the same as the meaning Amad. It means he was stationed. He remained in a fixed position. And that last level, which he doesn't really say, but to us should let us know, he entered the highest echelons of Egyptian society. We know later he's going to meet the Pharaoh, but at this point, he's really in charge of the household of Pharaoh's right-hand man. Pharaoh's apparently, general in chief. So each Vayehi is a higher level of success in this diaspora exile situation. The Abarbanel. He says, now Joseph, despite being a slave, that's what's, we're always amazed at the success of Jews in, Muslim society or Persian society in the Bible stories, or later in Christian societies. We're amazed, but his success is even more amazing because not only was he an alien, he was a slave. So his success is mamish, is really unusual and outstanding. So Joseph, despite being a slave to the rulers, constantly retained the fear of God. It is regarding this that it states, and the Lord was with Joseph. That is, that the thought of him was always in mind. So, in other words, that first phrase, according to the Barbanel, doesn't mean something that God did. That first phrase means something that Yosef did. Yosef was a tzaddik. He was such a righteous person because no matter where he was, no matter what was going on in his life, God was a constant thought. God was a constant companion, not because God did something yet, but because can fear be translated as awe? Depends on, I'm going to answer that question in a minute. Okay. I'll come back to it in a second. I just want to finish my thought. Good question. It wasn't so much that God was doing something, according to the Abarbanel. It was more that Yosef made sure that he always kept God in his consciousness, in his mind. He kept God in his life, which is a beautiful interpretation, very different from the norm and the sforno, which is the most famous pshat that God was with him. God was there because Yosef kept God there. We keep God with us by keeping God in our minds, that we feel the presence and therefore God is with us, not because of what God did, but because of what we're doing to keep God. That's a beautiful interpretation. And I'm going to go back to the question about it depends which word for fear is being used. When you have the Yud Resh Aleph, Yareh, which often is translated as fear, that term can often and most usually be translated as awe, which is a little bit different than fear. I'm not so much afraid of this person. I'm more in awe, wow, of this person, as opposed to a word like pachad. Pachad really means fear. But when it's the Yud Resh Aleph term for fear, it's quite often appropriate to translate that he was in awe, truly, truly impressed and feeling this sense of a special relationship. So Yud Resh Aleph also quite often means awe. Okay. Da, 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 da. So it says, and the Lord was with Joseph, second line in the Abarbanel, that is, that the thought of him, of God, was always in his mind. Accordingly, as a reward for this. So in other words, according to the Sforno and most commentaries, God initiated this relationship. According to the Abarbanel, it's a beautiful shot. I don't know which one's ultimately correct, but according to the Abarbanel, it's Yosef initiates this relationship. And as a result of this, accordingly, as a reward for this, he became a person who succeeded in every venture. Because he invited God in, God made sure that he was matzliach, successful in everything that he did. Okay. However, I consider the most accurate interpretation of these verses to be that three enormous acts of grace. Now, I happen to like the word grace, but a lot of Jews feel uncomfortable with the word grace. I remember when I was in Stanford and I would teach, especially adult education classes, and I used the term grace, by the grace of God. People got nervous. They felt, wait a minute, isn't that a Christian? Isn't that a Christian idea? Like Amazing Grace, which is also a beautiful song, but forgetting about that. It's just funny. No, grace is a Jewish concept too. The idea of where we succeed with the partnership of God, and God is providing something for us. And quite often you can use the word grace to mean in English for that gift that a Kadosh Baruch Hu grants. But okay, but what can I tell you? A lot of Jews in Connecticut were nervous No, that's Christian. Christians say great. Okay. Were conferred by God upon Joseph. So our verse, it starts off, according to the Barbanel, Yosef says, I am keeping God in my life, even in this diaspora exile place that other people might think is God forsaken. I don't think that. I think God's everywhere. I'm going to keep God uppermost in my mind, even here in Egypt. Okay? So, but then as a result of him making this commitment to God, God grants him three wishes. It's like a genie. Okay. God grants him three boons, three acts of grace, if you will. The first was that despite being a slave with a depressed spirit, he nevertheless enjoyed divine influence, that when he heard a dream, he could interpret it in accordance with that which would transpire in the future. That he was the first gift was the ability to interpret dreams. Interesting. I'm not sure if I would have put that number one, but okay. The second was they succeeded in everything he tried to do. And that's in our verse, he was a successful person. In that whatever he turned his hand to, he prospered. I have to say something about that word success in a second. The third is that the Almighty favored him in his master's house by allowing him to remain working inside the house. So third one, he became an indoor slave in charge of the actual, mansion of his boss. And he was in the house of his Egyptian man. Moreover, since each of these three were quite distinct, the narrative repeatedly utilizes Vayehi, 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 because there were three separate gifts from Hashem, and we're using the word Vayehi like Vayehi or, right? And there was light the same way that God was doing something. Oh, wow, amazing. One of the amazing things is the word Matzliach. And I no commentary on the verse talks about it. I should have brought down commentaries who say it in Psalms, in Hallel. What do we mean by Ana Hashem Hatzlichana as opposed to Ana Hashem Hoshiana? So Ana Hashem Hoshiana, save us, grant us salvation, save us from whatever bad situation. What's Matzliach? Matzliach is a higher level. Matzliach means that you are so successful that other people notice. Matzliach is not something that you can feel on your own. It's what other people feel, notice, intuit about you. An Ish Matzliach is someone that people say, wow, what a successful individual. Isn't he cool? That's what Matzliach is. And so he gets that at a very early level. There's no better example of Ish Matzliach in Tanakh where other people notice his remarkable success than Yosef. I mean, everywhere, everything he touches turns to gold. It's really amazing. And so we got that word right away at the beginning of this ordeal. He's an Ish Matzliach. And that is the connotation of what we mean when we say Matzliach. Okay, the Chizkuni, who goes back to the original interpretation that Vayehi means God was with him, he's from a totally different ballpark than the Abarbanel. The Chizkuni says he required divine assistance in order to insulate him against the temptation to adopt the corrupt ways of that country. The Chizkuni and the Abarbanel couldn't disagree more. The Abarbanel feels very strongly Yosef initiated this tremendous, successful life that he makes himself in Egypt by his being adamant to keep Hashem with him at all times. While the Chizkuni says, no, he was really in Tsaris, and it was a miracle that God granted him divine presence, not that Yosef had done anything in Egypt to bring it. It may be that he was already a good enough person back home, although the truth of the matter is, I mean, he seemed like a bit of a spoiled brat back at home. But anyways, be that as it may, he doesn't really seem to come into his own until he gets to Egypt. But it's just a totally different approach. And I'd like to think the Abarbanel is right. The Chizkuni makes it more miraculous, but I like people that succeed in their spiritual lives through their own personal efforts, and a Kadosh Baruch Hu responds. Okay, the Dat Zikanim, which is a totally different thing. I'm going to try to do it fast, only because he's on a different track. But it's a beautiful idea that I really like. The Midrash demands us to compare God's befriending us to how human beings befriend their masters or superiors. So in other words, this whole story about how Yosef succeeds in Egypt because God is blessing him, okay, is like so different than relationships with secular rulers, with human people of power. What's the difference? As long as if it's a human being, as long as their superiors are successful, the underlings surround the king and flatter him nonstop. As soon as the king falls on hard times, his former friends abandon him as they would a sinking ship. It's so interesting. It's so interesting that when someone, seems to be doing well, everybody's their friend. Their stock falls or their company fails. Nobody wants to talk to them. Nobody wants to be seen with them. Nobody wants their picture taken with them. The reverse is true of Hashem. God now went out of his way to make life easier for him. He's a guy who's down and out. God comes specifically to help the people who are in trouble. He supported him when he became viceroy of Egypt, when he was a slave to Potiphar, even when he was in jail. It is remarkable that Joseph's way of responding to the way the brothers had treated him was different from the way ordinary people would have reacted. That an alternative interpretation, Vayehi, imagine someone blessed with 10 children living in a different country. Instead of visiting them all, concentrated and spending time with the youngest who depended on him. Similarly, as soon as God saw that Joseph brought to Egypt, he hurried to supervise his fate, protected him from harm. He was afraid that unless he did so, Joseph might learn to copy this lifestyle of his masters. So in other words, the Dat Zikanim is emphasizing that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tends to be available to those people who need God the most. For God, a friend in need is a friend indeed. And it's a beautiful idea. I don't think it's pshat, and I don't, and it's a little bit different than everybody else is trying to figure out, what was going on with Yosef, but it's a beautiful idea. And I just couldn't, leave it out from the different approaches. The Sfat Emet, who is the second Gera Rebbe, talked about this verse in 9 different years. And I have 3 of them on the sheet. And they're very different. No, I like this about the Sfat Emet, about the Gera Rebbe, that he, every year he sees a slightly different meaning to the story. And I like that idea. In other words, stories mean one thing to us when they're Bible stories and we're, in the 2nd grade, and then they mean something else to us when we're in the 9th grade and we're starting to learn it with commentaries. Then it means something else to us when we go to college. Then it means something else to us when we get married. It means something else to us when we have children. It means something else to us when we have grandchildren. And I think I like that idea that my take on the verse changes as, I grow, hopefully mature, and look at things differently in different times in my life. So the Gera Rebbe in 1870, which was toward the very beginning of his time as the Rebbe. No, it's not 1870. That's a typo. That's my bad. It's 1880. It was 1880. He wasn't Rebbe yet in 1870. It was 1880. But okay. Oh, I'll have to. correct that. Um, he brings down so the first time that he seemed to have commented on this verse that he got into his book says Breshit Rabbah explains our verse to indicate that wherever a Jew goes, wherever any Jew goes, their inner essence accompanies them. In other words, when I change my my country or my environment, I'm still there's something about me that's still the same. Now, as I used to, work in this kind of company, now I work in a different kind of company. I used to, be a high school student. Now I'm a graduate school. That their inner essence that doesn't change. In exile, this essence is often obscured for a very simple reason. I mean, sometimes we're trying to like keep a low profile. We're like trying to hide a little bit who we are, and I remember having summer jobs, and I wasn't going to wear a kippah. I was going to wear a baseball cap. I mean, different environments. We tried to obscure who we really are, leading to an unsteady spiritual life force. Now, as we tend to, be less positive in everything. Clarity occasionally arises, allowing one to draw strength from the revealed light available to the tzaddik. When this happens, that I'm in a difficult situation that either is true galut or is a personal galut. Sometimes, I'm in, country X and I want to hide the fact that I'm Jewish. Okay. And sometimes I'm in my own home and everything, but I don't want people to know about my religious beliefs, and I'm a little shy about it for various reasons. I'm afraid what they'll think of me, whatever. Okay, but we tend to sometimes, change a little bit because we're concerned what people will think of us. But you can always connect to a tzaddik. Remember, he's a Hasidic Rebbe. The Rebbe is the tzaddik. The tzaddik can get you back to where you're supposed to be. And then he quotes a famous verse from Yeshayahu, Amcha kulam tzaddikim, but the Jewish nation, they're all tzaddikim, as we all can access this. In Yosef's story, the Torah repeatedly uses the phrase Vayehi. Why? To highlight the fluctuating experiences. Every time it says Vayehi, and there's a bunch of them, we're going to see there are 15 of them. We'll see that in the back page. That every time something happened where he needed a booster shot of divine support or tzaddik support, if he was a chassid, it says Vayehi. This enduring connection ensures that even in the darkest times and the darkest places, the divine light remains with Bnei Israel, providing hope and strength. What he meant was in 1880, in a suburb of Warsaw in Poland, that the Rebbe can help you find the spiritual strength that you need, just like Yosef found it. He's talking to his Hasidim and using the Joseph story to help him. 9 years later, Yosef was preparation for Galut. His story is a how-to book for living in Galus. He is trying to teach us. We use this story to teach us how we're supposed to survive spiritually when we are outside of Eretz Yisrael. We're in a Galut, exile, diaspora situation. As in, God was with Yosef. The et, remember I said at the beginning that this et in the verb, in the verse, Vayehi Hashem et Yosef, et doesn't make sense grammatically because there's no action verb. The et in the verse extends to all who have the inspiration of Yosef the tzaddik. God is with us in Galut as God was with Yosef in the house of the Egyptian master. Et is the verb, is the word that means that you are being acted upon. In other words, even though the verb doesn't mean vayehi, and it was, that's not an action verb, but the verb, excuse me, the word that can't be translated, the word et without translation means he was being acted upon. And that's how the Rebbe is dealing with the problem. The et means he was the object of something. What was the something? God's help, of God's inspiration. And then 1 year later than that, the Vayehi in Potiphar's house, that's our verse, then in jail, that's a few verses later on, they're going to have it again, and other circumstances, shows that he didn't change in changing circumstances. I don't know if this is true, but this is a famous midrashic interpretation that the Rebbe is using after he comes up with two very clever original ideas. He goes back to an ancient midrashic idea that the Vayehi meant he was the same Yosef here that he had been Yosef, back in Dotan, back in Beersheba. He was the same Yosef. He stayed the same. It's a famous interpretation that I got to be honest, I don't like it so much. I don't like it so much because we can't always stay the same. We have to grow and we have to mature and develop. But it's a famous midrashic approach that he just goes back to, like I said, sort of deep into the game here. This is also said in the verse in Shemot. And Yosef was Vayehi. This verb gets repeated at the beginning of Sefer Shemot, and he was in Egypt. He was always Yosef, whether a shepherd or a viceroy in Egypt, he never changed. This is the example of the tzaddik, who is the yesod, the foundation of the world, unmoving foundation. The essential test of galut is to not change our basic character. In galut, we wear, like on Purim, many masks, but underneath, the Rebbe is trying to tell us, stay who you've always been. It's a beautiful piece of advice for living in galut. We believe here in Eretz Yisrael that we can. Here we go. Rabbi Tversky once referred to the lobster that grows out. I have to open it. Rabbi Tversky once referred to the lobster that grows out of its shell. But he remains a lobster, I guess. Why would Robert Tversky talk about lobster? He was always religious. I would talk about lobster because should I turn the tape off? Because I remember eating lobster, when I was a kid. So the lobster grows out of its shell, but it still remains a lobster. Okay, nice. Okay, before we come back to some of the ideas we've been talking about spirituality in galut, I just had to put in Rabbi Bazak, Rabbi Amnon Bazak. I was in the army with. I have a new message. I was in the army with, and finds another. He observed that the conversation practice conversos. So in other words, we sometimes have to change our outer appearance for the new circumstances. And he's a few years younger than me, but a really, really nice, bright fellow. And he's written a wonderful book that's called From Time Immemorial, about changes in psukim and in things that developed in Jewish custom. So he's a Rebbe at Yeshivat Har Etzion, lives in the Gush, and he has a very different take on the story. And we're going to return to some to the more traditional approaches in about 8 minutes. But first, I just was fascinated by Rabbi Bazak's approach. A literary phenomenon to note is the intensive use of Vayehi. We have it 3 times in our verse. In this chapter, it appears 15 times. There are 23 verses, and 15 times we have that one verb, Vayehi, more than any other chapter in all of Tanakh. The word Vayehi expresses the unique sequence of events involving a great number of details that combine to produce a situation, or the situation, in which Yosef ends up in prison. Vayehi, every time it says Vayehi, a new detail of the story is being, and it was, and then that happened, and then that happened, and then that happened, and that brings us to Yosef in jail. So each Vayehi is another major step in this inevitable process. Involving a great number of details that combine to produce the situation in which Yosef ends up in prison. This intensifies our awareness of God's hidden intervention. Okay. Yosef's extraordinary ability is so apparent that even Potiphar takes note, appointing him to the senior position in his house. At this second stage, God's involvement is expressed in the blessing on all that Potiphar has, because not only is he a successful person, but his success rubs off on all those other people with whom he comes into contact. They become more successful. In the prison, here again, we note the similarity between Potiphar's house and the prison. Both stages conclude with a blow to Yosef. Yosef gets knocked down in both cases. Remember, he gets knocked down in Potiphar's house by being sent to prison. He gets knocked down in jail by thinking he's got a get-out-of-jail-free card from the butler, and he ends up being in jail for another 2 years, which must not have been pleasant. And we must ask, why is this so? After all, Yosef acted properly. He emphasized that dreams and their interpretations come from God. He didn't take credit. He said, God told me. Why does his proper behavior not produce any progress for him personally? He helped other people, but he didn't help himself. Why does he languish in prison for another 2 long years? What does Yosef mean to add by the phrase, here also I have done nothing? So he said, when he finally gets out of jail, he says, I was in jail, but I didn't do anything. I didn't try to rape Mrs. Potiphar. I should have been, I was a nice guy in jail, should have gotten out of jail. I didn't do anything. What Yosef's words suggest is that he still fails to recognize his own responsibility for what happened to him there. While it is true that he was stolen away, saying that he did nothing there represents some denial. The point of Rabbi Bazak is fascinating. And he says our entire section with all the different steps of Vayehi is a learning process for Yosef to take responsibility. He felt that he never did anything wrong. Now, all the other Meforshim, and the last one we're going to take a look, say Yosef never did anything wrong. He was only doing good things. The brothers didn't feel that way. And that's the point that he's going to make. While his brothers are responsible for selling him, Yosef cannot claim that he did nothing. Bringing evil reports about his brothers and telling them of his dream surely counts for something. They really hated him, and they hated him because he was pretty obnoxious. Attention should be paid to the fact that the trials Yosef has endured ensure our awareness of the significance of the word me'uma. Now, this is not a word we have a lot. Me'uma means nothing. From his history in Potiphar's house, we see that Yosef knows the qualifications that should surround this term. Concerning Potiphar's attitude towards him, we are told, and Potiphar lo yada ito me'uma, knew nothing. Sounds like Sergeant Schultz from the TV show. I know nothing. Okay, v'lo yada ito me'uma, of what he had, save the bread which he ate. He didn't know anything. There was sort of a certain, because Yosef did everything, Potiphar could claim he didn't know anything, and then not have to do anything of what he had, save the bread and that. And Yosef tells Potiphar's wife, there is none greater in this house than I, neither has he kept back anything from me. Your husband always gave me what I needed. I got everything. There was nothing that I lacked, but you, his wife. In contrast, when he says, here also I have done nothing, referring at the same time to his actions in the land of the Hebrews back in Eretz Israel, he seems to say it with not the slightest reservation. He never viewed himself as ever done anything that was negative. For this reason, he must remain in prison another 2 years. The extra 2 years in prison was to teach him, I have to look at my behavior and see that it wasn't always so admirable. I was annoying to my brothers and to my father. I have to take some of that responsibility on myself. Does he have any responsibility vis-a-vis the wife of Potiphar? I have no idea. It may just be that he was good looking, or it may be that he perhaps did some things that were someone might construe as flirtatious. I don't know. I'm not trying to accuse him of anything, but it's possible that he was in this level of denial. On his journey from the pit, the bore, the lowest levels of jail, to second in command to Pharaoh, Yosef passes through 2 stations, the house of Potiphar and the prison. In both places, he is recognized by the most senior character who places full confidence in him. In both instances, his faith in God is tested and he withstands the test. Rivka. In both cases, despite passing the test, he suffers some further punishment. Both delays arise from the need for Yosef to understand what he caused to his brothers and to finally assume responsibility. A totally different reading of the story and the use of all those vayahis in our chapter. I'm not sure I agree, but I think it's fascinating to think about it that way. And I think that it's also important to look at the sibling rivalry part of the story. And the sibling rivalry part of the story is going to crop up later when we get to the blessings toward the end of the book. So I'm not sure I'm on the same page with Rav Amnon, but I think the idea is fascinating and definitely worth thinking about. Okay, having said that, I'm going back to the normal approach, the more famous approach, which is that Yosef was Yosef a tzaddik, and he did these things not because he was annoying, but because he felt it was the best thing to do, and Hashem supported him in all of that. And the last comment is by the Netivot Shalom. Netivot Shalom was the Slonim Rebbe, and he died in the year 2000, and he was a Rebbe here in Eretz Yisrael, even though the Hasidus started Slonim in Poland. And big Talmud Chacham and a really, really wonderful person, Baruch Hashem. I got to meet him on 2 occasions. The spiritual level of Yosef was always connecting to God. Devekut. Devek means glue. Devekut, always clinging, connecting to Hashem. Therefore, he was a very successful person. The success was in direct relationship to its connection to God. Success comes from your relationship and connection to God. The Rambam said that one who is davuk to God has no judgment hanging over him and is successful in all endeavors. It's a beautiful idea. Rambam does hint at this idea in Moreh Nevuchim, but it's hard, to actually see in action many times. Only when one interrupts this connection does God remove hashgacha, divine supervision. This is a very high level, and it's unusual for a Jew to reach this level. I mean, how many of us can stay connected to God all the time? I mean, you're connected to God during davening, right? But are you connected to God when you're shopping? Are you connected to God when you're driving down the street? Are you connected to God when you're working? It's hard to keep that constant level of devekut connection to Hashem. So what do we do if we want to be successful and we want to, have a good life? If we can only achieve it through constant connection to God. Aha. However, there is another level, slightly lower, which is more attainable for everyone. It was written about by the Rebbe of Kalisk, another town in Europe. When one is connected to a society of God-fearing people, that each one is extended the general rachamim. I can't stay connected to God all the time, but you know what? I belong to a shul where everybody is trying to stay connected to God, and one of us is always connected to God. So we can benefit from each other's connection, and that this can work. Not quite as well as the first one, but it overall can be a really great idea. For in a group like this, at least one individual always is close and connected to God. In this way, all the judgments against this group are sweetened. This devekut. So before we that last idea, it's very beautiful idea that the Rebbe is saying in the name of another Hasidic Rebbe, that it's very important. I think we all would like to be like Yosef, the normative approach to Yosef, always connected to God. It's not easy. It's just not easy. I mean, just so many things happen in our lives to interrupt this connection, and things that we have to do. We just have so many things that have to be taken care of, paying bills, going to doctors. And I mean, just doing all these things, it's so hard. But if I truly am connected to a community of people who are sincerely trying to do this en masse, then I can get benefit from this unity that's formed. I think this idea is very beautiful. I think this idea is very important, that we can't necessarily reach the level that most of the commentaries think Yosef Tzaddik was on. But collectively, we might be able to get those kinds of benefits by being partnered with such a group. Then he makes one last statement. This devekut, this connection, this really binding with Hashem is especially potent on Shabbos. Our zug, our mate. In other words, the Gemara says that there are the 6 weekdays, that Monday is connected to Wednesday, and Tuesday is connected to Thursday. So they're all connected. But what about Shabbos? Shabbos doesn't have a mate. So Klal Yisrael, the Jewish people, we are the spouse. We are the mate for Shabbat. So that on Shabbat, we should be able to really have this devekut, this clinging, this connection to Hashem that Yosef had all the time. We should be able to achieve it at least on Shabbat. The essential power of Shabbat is to engender this devekut. That's what Shabbat is all about. All of the prohibitions of Shabbat aren't to make you bored or sad or upset. Like I remember, my kids, or when I was teaching teenagers, Why do I have to do that in Shabbos? Why can't I? No, it's to instead engender this dveikut, this clinging, this connection to Hashem, so that on Shabbos we should be able to feel like Yosef, always connected to Hashem. But if a Jew interrupts this dveikut, it is considered chilul Shabbos. Now, as I can profane Shabbat not by turning on a light or striking a match. I can profane Shabbat by losing my connection to God. So the beautiful thing about learning about Yosef isn't so much to just say, wow, wasn't Yosef amazing? It's more in the way of the Nativot Shalom. What can we do to be more like Yosef? And he gives two great pieces of advice. The first thing is belong to a group of people that your friends and your associates, the people that you hang out with, that you spend time with, should be the kind of people that want this connection. And hopefully there's always at least one of us who's doing it. And therefore we get that benefit. Sometimes I'm the link to God, and sometimes it's somebody else who's the link to God, but I'm linked to that person, so it works. And the other thing is that we should use Shabbat to make sure that we feel this connection, this dveikut, this clinging, this closeness to Hashem. And that's the point of almost all the comments, except for Amnon Bazak, which is fascinating, but totally different. The point of all of the other commentaries on this is Yosef was so successful in very adverse circumstances because of his connection to Hashem. And even if we might disagree with parts of this, the idea is extremely important. And our ultimate success in life depends on how connected we are to Hashem. And one of the ways we can do that is by connecting to wonderful people who are trying to do it as well. It's not so easy to do on your own, but in the right group of people, it is definitely attainable. So I always think the group in Ashkelon is just a wonderful group, trying to always be good and connected, and we just have to always inspire each other and together achieve this dveikut, this connection to Hashem. Okay, thank you all for joining this evening. And
thank you. And thank you for inspiring.
And refuah shlema to know.
Amen.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.